A manuscript was unearthed in an Egyptian tomb in 1886 that contains a text titled "According to Peter," and the ending it preserves tells a version of Jesus' last hours that will probably not sound familiar from Sunday school. What does that lost gospel reveal about the diversity of early Christianity, and why did it provoke such anxiety among church leaders? Let's walk through the discovery, read what survives, and tease apart the interpretive knots that have made the Gospel of Peter one of the most provocative non-canonical texts from antiquity. If you enjoy real historical investigations into early Christianity and forgotten texts, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future deep dives like this one. The physical circumstances are straightforward but important. The Greek manuscript we call the Gospel of Peter came to light at Akhmim, sometimes spelled Hemine, in Upper Egypt in 1886. The surviving codex itself is a late copy, probably from around the 6th century. Paleographers point to its handwriting and material features as characteristic of that period. Yet most scholars agree the composition it transmits is older, likely a 2nd century work, composed by someone writing in the era when Christian communities were still experimenting with different narratives and Christologies. Crucially, the book is pseudopicographical. It bears Peter's name as author, but internal and external evidence suggests it was not written by the apostle himself. If you enjoy explorations like this, please like and subscribe. There's more on early Christian texts ahead. What survives of the Gospel of Peter is concentrated on the final episodes of Jesus' story, his trial, crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. That fragmentary focus is already telling. Unlike the 4 canonical Gospels, which provide extended life narratives, teachings, parables, ministry, this text preserves mainly the passion narrative. Within that portion are several striking divergences from the familiar accounts, and these differences are precisely why scholars keep circling back to the manuscript. One of the most attention-grabbing shifts appears at the trial. In the canonical Gospels, the trial culminates with Pontius Pilate playing a central role, a Roman procurator who interrogates Jesus and ultimately authorizes his execution. In the Gospel of Peter, however, the juridical center temporarily shifts to Herod Antipas. Herod is portrayed as the primary figure conducting the trial, an unusual choice that alters the allocation of blame and changes the political thrust of the story. Pilate, in the Gospel of Peter, is largely exonerated. He appears as someone who washes his hands of culpability or is removed from central responsibility, a portrayal that contrasts sharply with the canonical emphasis on Roman involvement.
Another feature that raises eyebrows is the repeated framing of opponents in collective terms. The narrative often speaks of the Jews as the group demanding and performing Jesus' rejection. This collectivizing language is typical of many post-1st century Christian texts and can reflect polemical identity formation rather than straightforward reportage. It is important to stress, such phrases function rhetorically in a later textual environment and should not be read as an objective account of historical actors. They tell us more about the author's community and audience, who they were arguing against and how they defined themselves, than they tell us about the precise balance of power in early 1st century Judea. The resurrection scene in the Gospel of Peter is cinematic and highly unusual. 2 heavenly beings descend from the sky and remove Jesus' body from the tomb in full view of witnesses. Jesus is pictured as emerging in a way that emphasizes an extraordinary elevation. Some readers hear imagery of a figure who is taller or larger as he comes forth, and the cross itself is described as leaving the tomb and responding affirmatively when asked whether Jesus had preached to the dead. The cross speaks. A gravecloth description and a public procession of divine beings turn the event into a communal spectacle rather than a private discovery by a few followers. Equally striking is a cryptic final statement attributed to Jesus in this text, my power, you have left me." That formulation has been at the center of interpretive debates. It can be read in at least 3 different ways: as a deliberate theological claim that distinguishes a divine power from the human Jesus, as a linguistic or scribal variant of the more familiar gospel cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" or as a later editorial gloss that crept into the manuscript tradition. Each reading points in a different doctrinal direction, and each raises methodological cautions about how far we can push any single manuscript toward broad historical claims. It is precisely phrases like that which led some ancient and modern readers to associate the Gospel of Peter with Doceticism. Doceticism, broadly defined, is a Christological tendency that minimizes or denies Jesus' real physical suffering and incarnation, treating his human form as mere appearance. If the Gospel of Peter were intentionally emphasizing a separable divine power that leaves a suffering human shell behind, it would provide welcome evidence for docetic theology in circulation. Indeed, several 2nd century readers and later church figures did link the text to docetic or Marcionite circles. Marcion, a well-known 2nd century figure who promoted a radical separation between the God of the Hebrew Bible and the God revealed in Jesus, is often invoked as part of the background to these readings.
For those attuned to doctrinal nuance,
The Gospel of Peter could look like another piece of evidence in a patchwork showing divergent early Christian Christologies. But the picture is not that simple. The same text also includes language that suggests physical reality, an earthquake that occurs at the moment the body touches the ground, sensory details of the tomb, public witnesses seeing the event. Those elements are difficult to reconcile with a purely docetic reading. They remind scholars that ancient authors used complex tropes, rhetorical, liturgical, theological, and that no single phrase should be taken as conclusive proof of a coherent, systematic dogma. Alternatives to the docetic reading include the possibility that my power is a scribal or translational issue, perhaps a local idiom for divine presence, or a corrupted rendering of my God. Another option is that the passage reflects a performative liturgical phrasing that was never intended to function as a technical Christological statement, but rather to convey the felt experience of abandonment or triumph in worship settings. Textual critics add a further layer of caution. The surviving manuscript is not the original. It is a copy made several centuries after the probable composition. Copyists sometimes introduce idiosyncrasies, whether through misreading a faded letter, harmonizing a phrase to a familiar gospel, or glossing a difficult line. That means discerning the author's original words and intent requires careful paleographical and philological work. Scholars evaluate word choices, syntax, and parallel traditions when proposing emendations or alternative readings. So when we encounter an enigmatic line like, my power, you have left me, we should consider whether the problem arises from the original author, from a redactor, or from a later copyist. This kind of close reading, where manuscripts, theology, and historical context intersect, is what this channel is dedicated to. If you want to keep exploring early Christian texts beyond the canon, subscribing helps you stay with us for future investigations. Context matters in another way: reception history. The Gospel of Peter did not circulate in a vacuum. Ancient bishops and theologians noticed it and responded. Serapion of Antioch, a late 2nd century bishop, provides one of the earliest documented reactions. Initially permissive when a local community in Rhosis presented him with the gospel, Serapion changed his position when some of his clergy used the text in ways that demonstrated alignment with docetic interpretations. In letters preserved indirectly by later historians, Serapion records that he forbade the reading of the Gospel of Peter in liturgy once its doctrinal associations became apparent.
That episode shows two things at once. First, that the text was being used in real congregational contexts. Second, that church leaders were actively policing doctrinal boundaries as communities evaluated which texts to accept into worship and instruction. Later authorities also knew of the text. Origen and Eusebius refer to an Evangelion kata Petron, a gospel according to Peter, in their writings. Eusebius, writing in the early 4th century, includes the Gospel of Peter in his discussions of disputed books, labeling certain works as spurious or heretical. Origen, a sensitive and often eclectic theologian, is aware of various apocryphal Gospels and sometimes treats them as readworthy for certain historical or theological reasons, albeit with caution. Their references confirm that the Gospel of Peter existed in multiple literary memories and possibly in more than one textual form. Scholars therefore debate whether the Akhmim manuscript is identical to the text that Serapion encountered. Variations in circulation were common, and multiple Gospels of Peter or related fragments may have circulated side by side. What about authorship and date? Several internal features point away from Petrine authorship. The linguistic voice, theological concerns, and polemical tone mark the work as product of a later community, claiming apostolic authority by attributing it to Peter, a practice common in antiquity and not inherently fraudulent by modern standards. Pseudepigraphy could lend a text authority in a contested literary marketplace. Stylistically and thematically, most experts place its original composition in the 2nd century, a time when Christian groups were still consolidating narratives and competing theologies. The manuscript we have from Egypt dates to around the 6th century, which means there is a substantial temporal gap between composition and surviving copy. During that interval, the text could have been edited, interpolated, or reworked, which complicates direct claims about authorial intent. Turning back to content, the Gospel of Peter's narrative choices about agency, who judges Jesus and who carries out the violent acts, have attracted much scholarly attention. By centering Herod rather than Pilate, and by emphasizing Jewish perpetrators in terms of community antagonists, the text participates in a late antique trend of rhetorical repositioning. That trend sometimes served apologetic or polemical purposes. By shifting blame, the author could depict the Roman authorities in a less compromising light, or craft a narrative in which early Christians are actors in a larger cosmic conflict, rather than victims of imperial injustice. Readers should therefore exercise caution before treating these narrative shifts as reliable history.
They are more plausibly reflections of theological and identity concerns within the author's own community than transparent reports of first-century events.
Why then did church leaders worry enough to condemn or restrict the Gospel of Peter? The answer lies in how early Christian orthodoxy was being negotiated. By the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, bishops and theologians were working to define who belonged within the communal boundaries of orthodox belief. Texts that suggested radically different understandings of Christ's nature, his sufferings, or the relationship between the Christian God and the Jewish scriptures represented a threat to those constructing a coherent theological identity. Documents like the Gospel of Peter, with their distinctive Christological emphases and expressive rhetoric, offered alternative ways of imagining Jesus that could gain traction in congregations. Leaders such as Serapion therefore faced pastoral and doctrinal choices: allow diverse texts and risk doctrinal fragmentation, or regulate reading to preserve a growing consensus. This regulatory impulse is part of what eventually produced the canonical New Testament. The canon did not emerge overnight, but through prolonged debates about apostolicity. Did the text derive from an apostle or an apostolic circle? Orthodoxy, did it conform to theologically acceptable teachings? Antiquity, was it old enough to carry weight? And Catholicity, was it widely accepted across diverse Christian communities?
Third, it shows how identity boundaries were constructed through rhetoric. The repeated use of collective designators for opponents is an index of communal self-definition in a contested religious marketplace. These are not sensational conclusions. They are the sober implications of a text that comes from a period of theological and textual creativity. What about the more sensational motifs? A speaking cross or a public heavenly removal of a body? How should we interpret such imagery? One helpful move is to see such features as part of the narrative convention of sacred history and apocalyptic storytelling. Ancient authors often used dramatic, hyperbolic language to communicate theological truth rather than to provide journalistical accounts. A speaking cross can function symbolically, signaling cosmic confirmation of Jesus' victory over death, rather than claiming a literal piece of the historical scene. That interpretive lens preserves the theological force of the story, while restraining us from making naive historical claims. Another scholarly approach is to read the Gospel of Peter alongside liturgical traditions. Some scholars argue that elements of the text reflect liturgical memory, dramatized presentations of Christ's passion and resurrection that were performed or recited in communal worship shaped the written word. When a text shows heightened imagery and collective participation, it may be integrating or preserving liturgical expressions rather than reporting eyewitness testimony. There is also a philological angle. Certain words and syntactical structures in the Greek of the Gospel of Peter differ from canonical patterns, and the manuscript tradition we possess sometimes records variant readings that suggest transmissional change. Philologists look for parallel phrases in other apocryphal texts, in patristic citations, and in surviving liturgical fragments to reconstruct probable original meanings. That work has led some scholars to propose that passages read as docetic may originally have been less theologically sharp and more poetically charged, only later to be interpreted by readers with explicit doctrinal axes to grind. One more angle worth underlining is geographic and cultural. The Akhman manuscript was found in Egypt, a region where Christian literature of diverse stripes flourished. Egyptian Christianity in late antiquity was a hub for different monastic and theological experiments, and many non-canonical works have an Egyptian textual afterlife. The find spot therefore reinforces the plausibility of local circulation and usage, perhaps even revision, by Egyptian communities for whom the Gospel of Peter had meaning. That local dimension helps explain why Serapion and other bishops, often operating in Syria or elsewhere, encountered versions or uses of the text that disturbed them. So what should a careful modern reader conclude?
First, the Gospel of Peter is an invaluable witness to the plural and contested nature of Christian origins. It does not by itself dethrone the canonical Gospels, nor does it definitively prove a docetic Jesus or a particular heretical program. Rather, it enriches our picture by showing the kinds of narratives and theological articulations available to ancient readers. Second, phrases that appear to separate a divine power from a suffering figure must be handled with philological and contextual caution. They may reflect doctrine, scribal transmission, liturgical forms, or rhetorical strategy, or some combination. Third, the reactions of figures like Serapion reveal the practical stakes of textual circulation. The early church was actively engaged in determining which accounts were safe for public reading and which threatened emerging doctrinal consensus. Finally, consider the broader historical lesson. When we ask, what secrets does the Gospel of Peter reveal, the best answer is not a single bombshell, but a cluster of insights. That early Christianity was diverse in narrative and theology, that communities competed for interpretative authority, that pseudepigraphal attributions were widespread, and that institutional formation involved contestation over texts. These are not sensational revelations, but clarifying ones. They push us to read the origins of Christianity as a dynamic process in which texts were tools, battlegrounds, and conveyors of memory. If you want to read the Gospel of Peter yourself, modern translations and critical editions are available, and I've linked recommended academic resources in the description. Look for scholarly editions that include apparatus and commentary, and consider consulting patristic sources such as Serapian's fragments and the summaries by Origen and Eusebius for reception context. For those who want to dig deeper, I've also put together a playlist exploring other apocryphal Gospels and how they shaped debates about canon and creed. If this exploration expanded how you think about early Christianity, subscribe to the channel. Every day we bring new stories, forgotten texts, and deep historical investigations that go far beyond the surface. In the end, the Gospel of Peter does not replace the canonical narratives, but it compels us to broaden our historical imagination. It invites us to inhabit a world where different communities told different endings to the same story, and where the line between orthodoxy and heterodoxy was still being debated and redrawn. That is the real historical secret it hands us, a window into a plural past, messy and vibrant, in which the authoritative texts we now take for granted emerged out of argument, selection, and the hard work of theological persuasion.